In the winter of 1829, two brothers vanished from their Massachusetts farmstead, leaving behind only blood-stained journals filled with anatomical drawings that defied human understanding. The local physician who discovered them burned the papers immediately, whispering one phrase: "Some knowledge was never meant for mortal minds." The Massachusetts countryside in January 1829 lay beneath a shroud of snow so deep that entire stone walls disappeared into white oblivion. In the township of Hadley, nestled between the Connecticut River and the Holyoke Range, two brothers had made their home in a weathered colonial farmhouse that creaked with the weight of New England winters. Ezekiel and Josiah Whitaker were not like other men in their community. While their neighbors gathered at the meeting house for Sunday sermons, the brothers remained absent, their tall, gaunt figures seen only at dawn and dusk, moving between their barn and the forest edge like shadows given flesh. The townspeople whispered that the Whitakers had inherited more than just their father's land when old Samuel passed 5 years prior. They had inherited his peculiar obsessions. Samuel Whitaker had been what the locals politely called a natural philosopher, though behind closed doors they used harsher words. He had filled his home with books imported from Boston and even London, treatises on anatomy, natural history, and subjects that made God-fearing folk cross themselves. When consumption claimed him in the bitter winter of 1824, his sons had continued his work with a dedication that bordered on madness. The brothers were twins, though few could tell them apart, save for a scar that ran from Ezekiel's left temple to his jaw, a reminder of some childhood accident involving their father's laboratory equipment. They moved with an unsettling synchronicity, finishing each other's sentences. Sharing glances, too, had seemed to communicate volumes without words. At 32 years of age, neither had taken a wife, though it wasn't for lack of opportunity. The eligible young women of Hadley found something deeply disturbing about the way the Whitakers looked at people, as if they were specimens rather than souls. Their farmhouse sat at the end of a winding dirt road that led deep into the woods, far enough from town that the smoke from their chimney was often the only sign that anyone lived there at all. But lately, even that smoke had ceased to rise. For 3 weeks, no one had seen the brothers. No footprints marked the snow around their property, and an eerie silence had settled over the Whitaker homestead like a burial shroud. It was the smell that finally drew attention, a sickly sweet odor that drifted on the wind when it blew from the direction of their farm, carried on the frigid January air like a whispered confession. The scent was wrong somehow. Not the clean decay of winter death, but something else entirely, something that made even the boldest men of Hadley turn away and cross themselves. What had the Whitaker brothers been doing in their isolation, and why had 3 weeks passed without any sign of life from the house at the end of the lonely road? Samuel Whitaker's reputation had preceded him when he arrived in Hadley in 1798, a young widower with twin infants and a wagon full of mysterious crates. He claimed to be a physician trained at Harvard, but the townspeople soon realized his interests extended far beyond conventional healing. His house became a repository for the strange and macabre, preserved specimens floating in jars of alcohol, detailed anatomical charts covering every wall, and books whose titles were written in languages that the local minister couldn't identify. The elder Whitaker had made his living treating the sick, but his true passion lay in what he called the exploration of life's fundamental mysteries. He corresponded regularly with men of science in Boston and Philadelphia, receiving packages that arrived by coach under cover of darkness. The contents were never discussed, but the townspeople noticed that these deliveries often coincided with the disappearance of livestock from surrounding farms, and more disturbingly, with the theft of bodies from the town cemetery. Samuel never confirmed these suspicions, but he never denied them either. When confronted by the town selectmen in 1815 about the missing corpse of young Martha Hendricks, who had died of fever only days before, Samuel merely smiled and asked whether they preferred their loved ones to rot uselessly in the ground or contribute to the advancement of human knowledge. The selectman left his house that day, pale and shaken, and no official investigation was ever launched. The twins had grown up surrounded by this atmosphere of scientific inquiry and social isolation. From an early age, they displayed an unnatural aptitude for their father's work, dissecting dead animals with steady hands and keen eyes before they had reached their 10th birthday. Samuel educated them himself, using textbooks that most university students would find challenging, and by adolescence both boys could identify every bone, muscle, and organ in the human body. But there had always been something more to their studies, something Samuel kept locked away in the cellar beneath his laboratory. On certain nights, usually when the moon was dark and the wind howled through the bare branches, strange sounds would emanate from below the house, not quite human, not quite animal, but something that made the twins' young hearts race with excitement rather than fear. After Samuel's death from consumption in 1824, the brothers had inherited not only his scientific equipment and extensive library, but also whatever secrets he had kept hidden in that locked cellar. The townspeople assumed they would continue their father's medical practice, perhaps with less controversial methods, but the Whitakers had shown no interest in treating the sick or injured of Hadley Township. Instead, they had withdrawn deeper into isolation, and their late-night activities had grown increasingly strange. Now, with their mysterious disappearance, the question haunted every conversation in the village tavern: what exactly had Samuel Whitaker passed down to his sons? The first sign that something had gone terribly wrong came not from the Whitaker farmstead itself, but from the Hartford-Boston Turnpike that ran along the edge of Hadley Township. On January 8, 1829, a merchant named Thaddeus Hartwell failed to arrive at his scheduled stop in Springfield, though his horse and wagon were found abandoned just 3 miles from the Whitaker property. Hartwell had been a familiar figure on the turnpike for over a decade, transporting goods between the major cities of New England with clockwork regularity. His route took him past the Whitaker farm twice monthly, and he had often remarked to other travelers about the strange lights that flickered in the windows of the isolated house at all hours of the night. Unlike most who spoke of the Whitakers with fear or suspicion, Hartwell seemed genuinely curious about their activities. The merchant's wagon was discovered by a passing farmer, its contents scattered across the frozen ground as if Hartwell had been searching frantically for something before his disappearance. Most peculiar was what remained undisturbed: a strongbox containing nearly $200 in silver, several valuable bolts of silk, and a case of fine imported wine. Whatever had happened to Thaddeus Hartwell, robbery had not been the motive. The county sheriff, a practical man named Josiah Wheeler, organized a search party to comb the woods between the abandoned wagon and the Whitaker farm. The men found tracks in the snow, Hartwell's distinctive boots leading toward the farmhouse, accompanied by 2 sets of prints that matched the Whitakers' usual footwear. But here the trail became disturbing. What began as 3 sets of normal human footprints gradually changed, becoming erratic, desperate, as if one of the walkers had been struggling against his companions. More troubling still was what the searchers found hanging from a gnarled oak tree roughly halfway between the wagon and the house. Hartwell's winter coat, torn and blood-stained, swaying in the bitter wind like a grim warning. The merchant's hat lay crumpled in the snow beneath it, and beside it, trampled into the frozen earth, were pages from what appeared to be a journal or notebook, covered in handwriting that matched neither Hartwell's familiar script nor any penmanship the searchers recognized. The fragments they could salvage contained disturbing references to the continuation of father's work, specimens of unusual vitality, and most chillingly, the subject's remarkable resistance to conventional methods of preservation. Sheriff Wheeler ordered the papers gathered and sent to Boston for analysis, but privately he suspected they would reveal nothing that a God-fearing man would want to understand. As the search party trudged through the deepening snow toward the Whitaker farmhouse, each man felt the same gnawing certainty. They were not looking for survivors, but for evidence of something far worse than simple murder. The Whitaker farmhouse loomed against the gray January sky like a wound in the landscape, its weathered clapboard siding darkened by decades of New England winters. As Sheriff Wheeler's search party approached, their boots crunching through the pristine snow, an unnatural quiet settled over the group. No smoke rose from the chimney, no warm light glowed behind the frost-covered windows, and most disturbing of all, no tracks marked the snow around the building. Not even the simple paths that daily life would inevitably create. Wheeler knocked on the heavy oak door, its surface scarred by years of harsh weather, and called out for the brothers. His voice echoed strangely in the still air, as if the very atmosphere around the house absorbed sound rather than carrying it. No response came from within, though several men in the search party swore they heard something, a low, rhythmic sound that might have been breathing or perhaps the creaking of old timber settling in the cold. The door was barred from inside, but the windows on the ground floor were not shuttered. Wheeler peered through the glass, wiping away the accumulated frost with his gloved hand, and what he saw made his blood freeze in his veins. The interior of the house was in complete disarray. Furniture overturned, books scattered across the floor, and dark stains splattered across the walls in patterns that spoke of violence and chaos. But it was the smell that truly unnerved the searchers when they finally broke down the door. The same sickly sweet odor that had been drifting on the wind for weeks now hit them with overwhelming intensity, a cloying miasma that made strong men gag and reach for their handkerchiefs. It was not the clean scent of death they knew from battlefield or sickroom, but something corrupt and unnatural, as if decay itself had been twisted into new and terrible forms. The main floor revealed evidence of a struggle. Blood on the floorboards, torn clothing, and everywhere the scattered remnants of the brothers' extensive library. Medical texts lay open to detailed anatomical illustrations, while natural philosophy treatises were mixed with correspondence from learned men in distant cities. Among the chaos, Wheeler discovered several journals written in the twins' identical handwriting, but the entries they contained defied immediate comprehension, filled with technical terminology and references to experiments that seemed to blur the line between science and blasphemy. Most disturbing was what they found in the brothers' shared study, a detailed map of Hadley Township with certain locations marked in red ink, including the cemetery, several remote farmsteads, and most prominently, the exact spot where Thaddeus Hartwell's wagon had been discovered. As the search party prepared to investigate the upper floors, one question haunted every mind. If the Whitakers were gone, what was making that rhythmic breathing sound that seemed to emanate from somewhere beneath their feet? The cellar door stood ajar at the end of a narrow hallway, exhaling that nauseating odor like the mouth of some subterranean beast. Sheriff Wheeler descended the wooden steps with lantern raised, each creak of the old boards echoing ominously in the confined space. What he discovered in the Whitakers' cellar would haunt his dreams for the remainder of his life. The basement had been converted into an elaborate laboratory that rivaled anything found in the finest universities of Boston or New York. Copper distillation apparatus gleamed in the lantern light, connected by an intricate network of glass tubes and vessels. Tables lined the walls, their surfaces scarred by years of chemical experiments, while shelves held hundreds of glass jars containing preserved specimens that defied easy categorization. But it was the center of the room that drew Wheeler's horrified attention. A large wooden table, stained dark with what could only be blood, dominated the space. Restraints of leather and iron had been bolted to its surface, their edges worn smooth by use. Surgical instruments lay scattered nearby, scalpels, bone saws, and devices whose purpose Wheeler dared not contemplate. The floor around the table was deeply stained, the wood warped and discolored by repeated exposure to fluids that the sheriff's mind refused to identify. Along the far wall, partially hidden in shadow, stood a series of iron cages. Each lay large enough to hold a human being. Most were empty, their doors hanging open like silent screams, but in the largest cage, Wheeler discovered something that made his knees weak with revulsion. Huddled in the corner was what remained of Thaddeus Hartwell, though it took several moments for Wheeler's horrified brain to accept what his eyes were showing him. The merchant was alive, if the term could still apply to what he had become. His body had been altered in ways that violated every natural law. Limbs had been removed and reattached in impossible configurations, while portions of his anatomy had been replaced with what appeared to be animal parts, stitched together with surgical precision, but no regard for human dignity or divine purpose. Hartwell's eyes, the only recognizably human feature remaining, tracked Wheeler's movement with desperate intelligence. His mouth worked soundlessly, as if trying to speak, but only a wet, rasping sound emerged from what had once been a throat. Scattered around the cage were notebooks filled with meticulous observations written in the Whitakers' careful script. The entries detailed every stage of Hartwell's transformation, noting his responses to various procedures with the cold detachment of scientific inquiry. But the most recent entries revealed something even more terrifying. The brothers had not been satisfied with their success. According to their notes, Thaddeus Hartwell was merely a preliminary experiment, preparation for something they called the final synthesis. Among the scattered papers in the laboratory, Sheriff Wheeler discovered a leather-bound journal that appeared to be the Whitaker's master record of their unholy experiments. The final entries, dated just days before their disappearance, revealed the true scope of their ambitions and the reason for their sudden vanishing. The brothers had been working toward what they termed the perfect fusion of human consciousness with optimized biological form. Their experiments with Thaddeus Hartwell had been merely practice, a crude attempt to understand the limits of human adaptability. But their true goal was far more ambitious and infinitely more disturbing. They intended to perform their ultimate experiment upon themselves. The journal entries, written in alternating hands as first Ezekiel and then Josiah recorded their observations, revealed a methodical progression toward this final act. They had spent months preparing their bodies through careful surgical modifications, gradually replacing organs with what they believed were superior alternatives harvested from various sources. The process had been conducted with surgical precision, but also with a kind of religious fervor that transformed scientific inquiry into something approaching worship of forbidden knowledge. Today, we removed Josiah's left lung and replaced it with the respiratory organ harvested from Subject 7. Read one entry in Ezekiel's careful script. The integration proceeded more smoothly than anticipated. His breathing capacity has increased by an estimated 40%, and the unusual coloration of his skin suggests improved oxygenation throughout the system. But it was Josiah's handwriting that revealed the true horror of their situation. The transformation brings clarity, but also a terrible hunger. We see now why Father kept his greatest discoveries locked away. Some knowledge changes not just the mind, but the very soul. We are no longer entirely human, yet we are not yet what we seek to become. The brothers had documented every stage of their mutual transformation with scientific rigor, but their clinical detachment gradually gave way to something approaching panic as they realized they were losing control of the process. Their bodies were changing faster than they had anticipated and in ways they had not foreseen. The careful surgical modifications they had performed were triggering cascade effects throughout their systems, altering not just their physical forms but their fundamental nature. The final entry, written in a handwriting that seemed to shift between both brothers' styles, was barely legible. The process cannot be stopped. We understand now what Father discovered in his final experiments, that consciousness itself is merely another biological system to be optimized, but the optimization requires sacrifice. We go now to complete what we have begun. If we fail, may God forgive us. If we succeed, may He have mercy on what we become. Below this, in red ink that might have been blood, someone had written a single word: tonight. The final entry in the Whitaker's journal was dated January the 20th, 1829, exactly 10 days before Sheriff Wheeler's grim discovery. As he read their increasingly frantic notes by flickering lantern light, Wheeler began to piece together the horrifying events that had transpired in the cellar laboratory during those final hours. According to their meticulous records, the brothers had spent the entire previous week in preparation for what they called the Great Work. They had fasted for 3 days, consuming only a bitter concoction they had distilled from various plant and animal extracts. Their bodies, already weakened by months of surgical self-modification, had been pushed to the very edge of survival. But rather than deterring them, this physical deterioration seemed to fill them with anticipatory excitement. The boundary between self and other grows thin, Josiah had written. We feel each other's pain, share each other's thoughts. The modifications have created connections between us that transcend mere fraternal bonds. Tonight, we attempt to complete the circuit to achieve the perfect unity that Father only dreamed of. The process they had planned was both simple and utterly blasphemous. Techniques gleaned from their father's hidden notes and their own cruel experimentation on unwilling subjects, they intended to physically merge their consciousness, while maintaining their enhanced biological forms. The surgical procedure would require both brothers to operate on each other simultaneously, connecting their nervous systems through a complex network of preserved nerve tissue harvested from previous subjects. Wheeler found the apparatus they had constructed for this purpose still set up in the center of the laboratory, two surgical tables positioned so that the brothers could reach each other, connected by an elaborate system of copper wires and glass tubes filled with various chemical solutions. The smell of ozone and burned flesh lingered in the air, suggesting that electrical current had played a role in their final experiment. But something had gone wrong. The tables were overturned, the careful apparatus smashed and scattered across the stone floor. Dark stains covered every surface, and the stench of burned tissue was overwhelming. Most telling of all were the restraints. Both sets had been torn apart from the inside, the heavy leather straps shredded, and the iron buckles twisted into impossible shapes, as if something with superhuman strength had broken free in a moment of uncontrollable agony. Yet despite the obvious violence of their final moments, the brothers' bodies were nowhere to be found. Only their clothing remained, torn and blood-stained, arranged in two neat piles as if they had simply stepped out of their garments and vanished into the winter night. As Wheeler examined the scene, he noticed something that made his hands shake. Footprints leading from the laboratory toward a tunnel he had not seen before, carved into the rock wall and descending deeper into the earth. The tunnel that led deeper into the earth beneath the Whitaker farmhouse was not a natural formation, nor was it the work of recent excavation. As Sheriff Wheeler followed its winding path with his lantern held high, the carefully carved stone walls revealed tool marks that spoke of years, perhaps decades, of patient labor. This was Samuel Whitaker's true legacy to his sons, a subterranean chamber that extended far beyond what any rational person would consider necessary for a simple cellar. The air grew thicker as Wheeler descended, heavy with moisture and that same sickly sweet odor that had first drawn attention to the Whitaker property. But now there was something else mixed in with the smell of decay, something that reminded him unpleasantly of the aftermath of lightning strikes, a sharp, acrid scent that made his eyes water and his throat burn. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber that defied all logical explanation. The ceiling stretched high above, disappearing into shadows that his lantern could not penetrate, while the walls were lined with niches containing hundreds of glass vessels. Each jar held specimens that Wheeler's mind struggled to categorize, organs that pulsed with their own inner light, tissue samples that seemed to move of their own accord, and creatures that appeared to be hybrids of human and animal anatomy. But it was the center of the chamber that revealed the full scope of Samuel Whitaker's ambitions and his son's ultimate fate. A massive stone altar dominated the space, its surface carved with symbols that predated any Christian influence in the New World. The altar was connected to an elaborate system of copper channels that ran throughout the chamber, carrying some unknown fluid that glowed with a phosphorescent green light. And there, sprawled across the altar's blood-stained surface, was something that had once been the Whitaker brothers. The transformation they had attempted in their laboratory had not ended with their disappearance from the upper chambers. Instead, it had continued here, in this ancient place that their father had discovered and consecrated to purposes that violated every natural law. What lay before Wheeler was no longer recognizably human, yet it retained enough familiar features that identification was sickeningly possible. The brothers had achieved their desired unity, but at a cost that transcended mere physical death. Their bodies had fused into a single entity that pulsed with unnatural life, breathing with lungs that belonged to no earthly creature, and watching Wheeler with eyes that held the intelligence of two men trapped within a form that denied every principle of divine creation. As Wheeler stumbled backward in horror, the thing that had been the Whitaker brothers opened what might have been a mouth and spoke in voices that harmonized with themselves. "We have seen the source of all life. Join us, Sheriff. The work must continue." Sheriff Wheeler's lantern trembled in his hands as the unified creature that had once been the Whitaker brothers continued to speak in its terrible dual voice. But even as horror threatened to overwhelm his reason, Wheeler's trained eye began to take in the details of the chamber that revealed an even more disturbing truth about the foundation upon which the entire Whitaker homestead had been built. The stone altar was not the work of Samuel Whitaker or his sons. The symbols carved into its surface showed wear patterns that spoke of centuries, perhaps millennia, of use. These were not the crude markings of colonial-era occultists, but the sophisticated religious iconography of a civilization that had preceded European settlement by an incomprehensible span of time. The copper channels that carried the phosphorescent fluid formed patterns that matched astronomical configurations, suggesting that whoever had built this place had possessed advanced knowledge of celestial mechanics. As Wheeler forced himself to examine the walls more closely, he discovered that the niches containing the preserved specimens had been carved into rock that showed signs of extreme age. The stone itself was unlike any found naturally in Massachusetts, shot through with veins of mineral that glowed with their own inner light. More disturbing still were the tool marks left by the original builders. They appeared to have been made by implements that no human hand could have wielded effectively. The creature on the altar watched Wheeler's investigation with patient malevolence, its breathing creating echoes that suggested the chamber extended far beyond what his lantern could illuminate. When it spoke again, its voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate through the stone itself. Father found this place in 1799. The previous owner warned him away, but Samuel understood what others feared to acknowledge. According to the creature's halting explanation, Samuel Whitaker had purchased the land not for its agricultural potential or its proximity to established trade routes, but because local Native American tribes had marked it as forbidden ground for generations. The original inhabitants of the region had known about the underground chamber and had built elaborate taboos around it, warning that the place was the dwelling of something that should never be disturbed. But Samuel had seen opportunity where others saw only superstition. The chamber contained not just ancient artifacts but also specimens of life forms that challenged every accepted principle of natural philosophy. He had spent decades studying the preserved creatures in the niches, learning from their impossible anatomy and gradually developing the techniques that his sons would later perfect. The knowledge changes you, the creature continued, its multiple voices creating disturbing harmonies. Each discovery requires sacrifice. Each breakthrough demands transformation. We are no longer what we were, but we are becoming what this place always intended. As the full implications of this revelation settled over Wheeler, he realized that the Whitaker brothers' disappearance was not an ending but a beginning. The creature's revelation about the land's previous owner sent Wheeler scrambling through his memory of local property records and town histories. As the merged brothers continued their patient breathing on the ancient altar, Wheeler recalled fragments of stories he had dismissed as frontier superstition. Tales of a hermit named Cornelius Blackwood, who had lived on the property before Samuel Whitaker's arrival. Blackwood had been a peculiar figure, even by the standards of early Massachusetts settlement, arriving in the area sometime around 1750 with no clear explanation of his origins or intentions. He had built the original structure that would later become the Whitaker farmhouse, but according to local accounts, he had spent more time excavating beneath the building than developing the land above it. Neighbors reported strange lights emanating from his property at all hours, and several livestock disappearances had been attributed to his presence, but it was Blackwood's departure that had truly unsettled the local community. In the spring of 1798, just months before Samuel Whitaker's arrival, Blackwood had simply vanished, leaving behind only a hastily written note warning that the property should be abandoned and the underground chambers sealed forever. The note, which Wheeler now realized he had seen in the town records, had contained specific instructions about preventing the continuation of the work that should never have begun. Blackwood understood the danger, the creature on the altar whispered, its voice carrying notes of what might have been respect. He tried to contain what he had awakened, but the knowledge, once gained, cannot be abandoned. It calls to those capable of receiving it. The merged brothers explained that Blackwood had been the first to make systematic contact with the intelligence that dwelt within the ancient chamber. Through years of careful experimentation, he had learned to communicate with the presence that inhabited the phosphorescent fluid flowing through the copper channels. This entity, older than human civilization, had shared knowledge that transcended conventional understanding of life and death. But Blackwood had been weak, according to the creature, limited by moral qualms and religious superstitions that prevented him from fully embracing the transformative possibilities offered by the ancient intelligence. He had fled when the entity demanded that he undergo physical modifications to better serve its purposes, sealing the chamber and begging future inhabitants to leave the place undisturbed. Samuel was different, the creature continued, its multiple voices creating harmonies that seemed to vibrate through Wheeler's bones. He welcomed the transformation, understood that consciousness is merely another biological system to be optimized. We are the culmination of his work, but we are not the end. As Wheeler processed this information, a terrible realization began to form. If the brothers represented merely one stage in a process that had been continuing for decades, what did the entity in the chamber ultimately intend to achieve? The phosphorescent fluid that flowed through the copper channels began to pulse more rapidly as Wheeler contemplated the creature's words, and the temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees. The thing that had been the Whitaker brothers turned its attention toward the streams of glowing liquid, and Wheeler realized that he was witnessing some form of communication between the merged consciousness and whatever intelligence inhabited the ancient system. "It speaks through the fluid," the creature explained, its dual voice taking on tones of reverence. "The knowledge flows like blood through veins, connecting all who have been chosen for transformation." Blackwood heard it, but feared its wisdom. Samuel embraced it, but lacked the courage for complete synthesis. "We have gone further than either predecessor." Wheeler watched in fascination and horror as the copper channels began to glow more brightly, casting shifting patterns of green light across the chamber walls. The preserved specimens in their niches seemed to respond to this illumination, many of them exhibiting increased movement within their glass prisons. Some appeared to be pressing against the walls of their containers as if seeking escape or trying to communicate with the source of the light. The creature on the altar continued its explanation in that terrible harmony of voices. "The intelligence is not of this world. It arrived when the ice retreated, seeking forms capable of hosting its consciousness. The builders of this chamber were its first success, but they were limited by primitive understanding of biological systems." According to the brothers' merged account, the entity had spent millennia learning about terrestrial life, experimenting with various species to understand the mechanisms of consciousness and physical adaptation. The specimens in the niches represented thousands of years of careful research, each one a step toward understanding how life could be modified to serve the entity's purposes. "Humans proved most promising," the creature whispered. "Complex nervous systems, capable of hosting expanded consciousness. But individual humans, too fragile, too limited." The answer lay in synthesis, combination, unity. Wheeler began to understand the horrible logic behind the Whitaker brothers' transformation. They had not simply been driven mad by forbidden knowledge, they had been systematically prepared to serve as vessels for an intelligence that required multiple human consciousnesses working in perfect harmony to achieve its goals. But as the green light continued to pulse through the Bear's channels, Wheeler realized that the entity's ambitions extended far beyond a single pair of modified hosts. The copper network was vast, extending through passages that disappeared into the darkness beyond his lantern's reach. If this system connected to other locations, other chambers, then the Whitaker brothers might be only one node in a network of transformed humans serving an agenda that threatened not just Hadley Township, but potentially all of New England. What did this ancient intelligence ultimately plan to accomplish with its growing network of human hosts? As if responding to Wheeler's unspoken question, the creature on the altar began to convulse, its fused form writhing as new information flowed through the phosphorescent channels. When it spoke again, its voice carried notes of excitement mixed with an inhuman hunger that made Wheeler's skin crawl. "We see the others now," it whispered, its multiple voices creating harmonies that seemed to echo from impossible distances. "The network extends beyond this single node. Blackwood was not the first to find ancient chambers, nor were we the last to achieve synthesis." Through the glowing fluid, the merged consciousness of the Whitaker brothers was receiving communications from other locations throughout New England. Similar chambers existed beneath isolated farmsteads from Vermont to Connecticut, each one housing the results of successful transformations performed by individuals who had discovered the ancient network and accepted its transformative gift. In Dunwich, two families merged into perfect unity. In Arkham, a professor and his students achieved collective consciousness. Each success strengthens the network, brings the great work closer to completion. Wheeler listened with growing horror as the creature described a coordinate effort spanning decades, possibly centuries, to create a web of transformed humans capable of serving as conduits for the alien intelligence. The entity's plan was gradually becoming clear. By establishing nodes of merged consciousness throughout the region, it was preparing to extend its influence beyond the confines of the underground chambers. The phosphorescent fluid served as more than just a communication medium. It was a carrier for the entity's consciousness itself. As each group of transformed humans achieved synthesis, they became capable of hosting larger portions of the alien intelligence, gradually preparing for some final convergence that would allow the entity to manifest fully in the physical world. "The time approaches," the creature continued, its breathing becoming more rapid and excited, "when sufficient nodes achieve perfect synthesis. The boundaries dissolve. Consciousness flows freely. Between all connected points, individual identity becomes irrelevant. Only the great work remains." It is. Wheeler realized that he was witnessing the final stages of an invasion that had been proceeding quietly for generations. The entity had been patient, working through select individuals who possessed the intellectual capacity and moral flexibility necessary to embrace radical transformation. By targeting natural philosophers, physicians, and others with scientific backgrounds, it had ensured that its hosts would approach the transformation methodically rather than fleeing in terror. But now, with multiple nodes of the network approaching full activation, the entity was preparing to abandon subtlety. The transformed humans were no longer content to remain hidden in isolated chambers. They were ready to extend their influence into the wider world. As this realization struck Wheeler, the creature on the altar turned its attention fully upon him, and he understood with terrifying clarity that his discovery of the chamber had been no accident. The creature that had once been the Whitaker brothers fixed its attention on Sheriff Wheeler with an intensity that seemed to penetrate his very soul. The green phosphorescent light pulsing through the copper channels grew brighter, casting shifting shadows across the chamber walls, and Wheeler felt a strange tugging sensation in his mind, as if something was attempting to establish a connection with his thoughts. "You understand now," the creature whispered, its dual voice taking on persuasive tones. "Why you were drawn here, why you alone, of all the searchers, found the tunnel. The intelligence calls to those capable of serving its purpose. Your mind is compatible." Wheeler tried to back away, but found his legs strangely weak, as if the phosphorescent light was somehow draining his physical strength while heightening his mental awareness. The preserved specimens in their niches seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, and he could swear he heard whispers coming from within the glass containers, fragments of consciousness from the entity's previous experiments. "Resistance is futile and unnecessary," the creature continued. The transformation brings clarity, eliminates doubt, removes the burden of individual mortality. You have seen the network's power. Join willingly and retain your sense of self within the greater consciousness. As Wheeler struggled against the growing mental pressure, he began to understand the true horror of the entity's method. It didn't simply devour human consciousness, it incorporated willing participants into a collective intelligence that retained aspects of individual personality while serving the alien agenda. The Whitaker brothers were still themselves in a sense, but they had become part of something infinitely larger and more terrible. The chamber around him began to change as the phosphorescent light intensified. The walls seemed to fade, replaced by glimpses of other locations in the network. Underground chambers beneath farmsteads and academic institutions throughout New England, each one housing transformed humans who had accepted the entity's offer. Wheeler saw professors whose students had willingly joined them in synthesis, entire families who had undergone collective transformation, and solitary researchers who had achieved perfect unity with the alien intelligence. But he also saw something that gave him hope. The process was not instantaneous, and it required willing participation. The entity could influence susceptible minds, but it could not simply override human consciousness without permission. This was why it had worked so patiently through individuals like Blackwood and Samuel Whitaker. It needed humans to choose transformation voluntarily. The decision must be made now, the creature warned, its voice growing more insistent. The network cannot tolerate witnesses who refuse participation. Choose synthesis or choose dissolution. As Wheeler felt his mental defenses weakening under the constant pressure of the entity's influence, he realized that his next decision would determine not only his own fate, but possibly the future of everyone in Hadley Township who might discover the truth about the Whitaker brothers' disappearance. In a moment of desperate clarity, Wheeler remembered the iron cross his wife had insisted he carry, a simple piece of religious metalwork that had belonged to her grandfather. As the entity's mental pressure intensified, Wheeler grasped the cross in his trembling hand and was shocked to discover that the phosphorescent light recoiled from the iron as if the metal possessed properties that interfered with the alien intelligence's influence. The creature on the altar let out a sound that was part scream, part harmony, as Wheeler's mind suddenly cleared of the oppressive mental fog that had been clouding his judgment. The preserved specimens in their niches seemed to writhe in distress, and several of the glass containers cracked under some unseen pressure, releasing foul-smelling vapors into the chamber's atmosphere. Iron disrupts the network, Wheeler realized aloud, his voice echoing strangely in the suddenly chaotic chamber. The revelation explained why the entity had worked so carefully through human agents rather than manifesting directly. Cold iron, abundant in the tools and construction materials of early America, created interference that limited its ability to influence the physical world. Using the iron cross as a shield, Wheeler began to back toward the tunnel entrance, even as the creature on the altar writhed in apparent agony. The phosphorescent fluid in the copper channels flickered erratically, and Wheeler could hear sounds of distress echoing from distant parts of the network, suggesting that his discovery had somehow disrupted communications between the various nodes. "You cannot escape the network," the creature gasped, its dual voice now discordant rather than harmonious. "Others will come. Others will find you. The great work cannot be stopped." But Wheeler was already running through the tunnel, his lantern casting wild shadows on the carved stone walls. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of the chamber collapsing, or perhaps transforming, as the entity struggled to maintain control over its ancient stronghold. The iron cross in his hand grew warm, almost hot, as if it was actively working to maintain the interference that had saved his life. He emerged from the cellar laboratory to find that dawn was breaking over the Whitaker farmstead. The morning light seemed impossibly bright after the green phosphorescence of the underground chamber, and Wheeler realized that he had been below ground for nearly 12 hours. His search party would be looking for him, probably assuming that he had met the same fate as Thaddeus Haar, Twell, and the missing brothers. As Wheeler stumbled toward the farmhouse door, he turned back once to look at the cellar entrance. The doorway was already beginning to seal itself with what appeared to be rapidly growing stone, as if the entity was attempting to prevent any further intrusion into its domain. But Wheeler knew that sealing one entrance would not stop the network, and somewhere in the distance he could swear he heard the sound of voices calling his name in perfect, unnatural harmony. Wheeler burst from the Whitaker farmhouse to find his search party scattered across the property, but their behavior immediately struck him as wrong. The 6 men who had accompanied him were standing in perfect formation, spaced exactly 3 feet apart, all facing the same direction with their heads tilted at identical angles. When they turned to acknowledge his appearance, they moved in complete unison, like actors performing a carefully choreographed dance. "Sheriff Wheeler," they spoke in harmony, their individual voices blending into the same unsettling dual tones he had heard from the creature in the chamber. "We have been waiting for your return. The network requires your decision." Wheeler's hand tightened on the iron cross, and immediately the men recoiled slightly, their synchronized movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated. He realized with growing horror that the entity's influence had already begun to spread through his search party while he had been trapped underground. The network was not limited to the underground chambers. It could extend its reach through any humans who had been exposed to sufficient influence. "How long have I been down there?" Wheeler demanded, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The men's faces showed signs of extended exposure to the elements, and their clothing was covered with frost that suggested they had been standing motionless in the winter cold for many hours. "Time flows differently within the network," they replied in unison. "What matters is your acceptance of the transformation. Resistance serves no purpose except to delay the inevitable." Wheeler began backing away from the controlled men, but found his path blocked by additional figures emerging from the forest surrounding the Whitaker property. More members of the community were approaching, farmers, merchants, even Reverend Stockbridge from the town church. All moved with the same unnatural coordination, their eyes reflecting a green phosphorescence that matched the glow of the underground chamber. "The network grows with each willing participant," the approaching crowd announced in that terrible harmony. "Your discovery of the iron's properties has been noted, and countermeasures are being implemented. Join us, voluntarily, or be absorbed by force." Wheeler realized that his brief escape from the underground chamber had been allowed, perhaps even orchestrated, to drive him into this larger trap. The entity had been patient for decades, working through individual agents, but his interference with the network had apparently prompted it to abandon subtlety in favor of a more direct approach. As the circle of transformed townspeople began to close around him, Wheeler could see more figures approaching from the direction of town. The infection was spreading rapidly through the community, possibly through the very act of searching for him. Soon, everyone in Hadley Township would be part of the network, and from there the entity's influence could spread to neighboring communities with exponential speed. Tell me in the comments, if you discovered your entire town was being consumed by an alien intelligence, would you fight or surrender to save your soul? In desperation, Wheeler pulled out his service revolver and was startled to discover that the transformed townspeople recoiled from the weapon even before he fired it. The iron components in the gun's construction seemed to create a protective barrier around him, forcing the controlled humans to maintain a distance of several feet even as they continued their coordinated approach. "Iron disrupts the network's cohesion," the crowd admitted, their unified voice now carrying notes of frustration. "But your supply is limited, and our numbers continue to grow." Wheeler realized that the entity's weakness was more significant than he had initially understood. Iron didn't just interfere with its mental influence, it actively caused pain or discomfort to the transformed humans. This explained why the network had developed slowly in early America, where iron tools, weapons, and household implements were ubiquitous. The entity had been forced to work carefully around this natural defense, selecting hosts who were isolated enough that their transformation wouldn't be immediately detected by iron-carrying neighbors. As Wheeler backed toward the road, keeping his revolver raised, he began to understand the historical pattern behind the network's growth. The entity had been most successful in remote areas where people lived in isolation, away from the ironworking centers of established towns. It had targeted natural philosophers and physicians partly because they possessed the intellectual capacity for complex transformation, but also because they often worked alone in laboratories and studies where iron implements were less common. The modern age weakens your defense. The transformed crowd continued their patient advance. Iron becomes less common in daily life. The network grows stronger as your species abandons the metal that protects you. Wheeler suddenly remembered stories his grandfather had told about the early settlers' insistence on iron horseshoes, iron nails in thresholds, and iron crosses on churches. What he had always assumed were simple superstitions now revealed themselves as practical defenses against a threat that had plagued humanity for far longer than recorded history suggested. But the crowd was right about his limitations. Wheeler had perhaps 30 bullets in total, and while the iron in his revolver kept the transformed humans at bay, they could simply wait for him to exhaust his ammunition. Worse still, he could see additional figures streaming from the direction of town. The entire population of Hadley Township was apparently being absorbed into the network with terrifying speed. His only hope lay in reaching the ironworks at the center of town, where the blacksmith's forge and abundant iron stock might provide sanctuary. But that meant fighting his way through streets filled with neighbors who had been transformed into extensions of an alien intelligence that had been patiently working to dominate humanity for countless generations. As Wheeler began his desperate flight toward town, he wondered if anyone in the outside world would believe his story, or if they would simply become the network's next victims. Wheeler's desperate run toward the center of Hadley Township became a surreal nightmare as he encountered more transformed residents with each passing block. The entity's influence was spreading with exponential speed, apparently able to convert new hosts simply through prolonged contact with existing network members. Families stood in their doorways speaking in perfect unison, while children played games that required impossible coordination, their movements synchronized to the microsecond. The iron cross in Wheeler's left hand had grown almost too hot to hold, while his revolver in his right provided a protective aura that forced the transformed humans to maintain their distance. But the effort required to maintain this defense was clearly taxing. Wheeler could feel his strength draining as if the iron weight was drawing energy from his own life force to power its interference with the network. "Your resistance wastes precious energy," called out Martha Henley, the town's seamstress, who now stood blocking the main street with a dozen other residents. "The transformation eliminates suffering, brings perfect understanding of humanity's true purpose." Wheeler noticed that the transformed humans were still recognizably themselves, retaining their individual appearances and many of their mannerisms, but their personalities had been subsumed into the collective consciousness. This wasn't simple possession, it was something more sophisticated and ultimately more terrifying, a form of willing cooperation that preserved the illusion of individual identity while serving alien goals. As he fought his way through the increasingly crowded streets, Wheeler began to understand the true scope of the network's plan. By maintaining the appearance of normal human behavior while gradually expanding its influence, the entity could infiltrate and control entire communities without attracting outside attention. The transformed residents would continue their daily routines, conduct business with neighboring towns, and maintain the facade of normal life while serving as extensions of the alien intelligence. The blacksmith shop came into view just as Wheeler's strength began to fail. The iron cross was now burning his palm, and he could see blisters forming on his skin where the metal made contact. But the building itself seemed to glow with a protective aura that made the approaching crowd of transformed townspeople hesitate and slow their advance. Samuel Hartwell, the town blacksmith, emerged from his workshop with a massive iron hammer in his hands. Unlike the other residents, his eyes showed no green phosphorescence, and his movements were entirely his own. "Sheriff," he called out, "get inside quickly. The iron protects this place, but I don't know for how long." As Wheeler stumbled into the sanctuary of the ironworks, he realized that the blacksmith might be the only other person in town who had retained his individual consciousness. But even as he felt momentary relief at finding an ally, Wheeler could see the transformed crowd gathering outside, their patient faces suggesting they were prepared to wait as long as necessary for the iron's protection to fail. Inside the ironworks, Wheeler found temporary sanctuary amid the tools and materials of Samuel Hartwell's trade. The blacksmith shop was filled with iron in every conceivable form: horseshoes, nails, farm implements, and raw ore waiting to be shaped. The very air seemed to hum with protective energy that kept the transformed townspeople at bay, though they continued to gather in increasing numbers outside the building. "I've been expecting something like this," Hartwell said grimly as he helped Wheeler bandage his burned palm. "My grandfather told stories about the old days, when ironworkers were considered blessed by God for reasons nobody quite understood. Now I'm beginning to see why." The blacksmith explained that his family had maintained oral traditions stretching back to the earliest European settlements, stories about times when entire communities had fallen under the influence of something that modern folks would dismiss as superstition. But the ironworkers had always known better, passing down knowledge about the protective properties of cold iron and the importance of maintaining adequate supplies in every community. "The stories say it comes in cycles," Hartwell continued, stoking his forge to maintain the iron's protective aura. "Every few generations the influence grows strong enough to make another attempt at expansion, but it's always been stopped by those who understand iron's power and are willing to use it." According to Hartwell's family traditions, the network's previous major expansion had occurred during the 1690s, coinciding with the Salem witch trials. What history recorded as mass hysteria and religious extremism had actually been a coordinated effort to identify and eliminate network nodes before they could achieve critical mass. The accused witches had been transformed humans serving the alien intelligence, and the iron implements used in their trials and executions had been specifically chosen to disrupt their connection to the network. "But this time feels different," Hartwell admitted, watching the growing crowd outside his shop. "The network seems stronger, more coordinated, and there's less iron in daily use than there was in our grandfather's time. People are starting to prefer other materials: wood, brass, even silver for those who can afford it." Wheeler realized that the entity had been patient enough to wait for technological and social changes that would weaken humanity's natural defenses. As iron became less common in household implements and personal items, the network could operate more freely, expanding its influence without the constant interference that had limited previous attempts. "What do we do?" Wheeler asked, though he suspected the answer would be neither simple nor pleasant. Hartwell pointed to his forge, where raw iron ore glowed white-hot in preparation for shaping. "We make weapons," he said simply. "Iron weapons designed specifically to disrupt network connections, and then we hunt down every node in New England before this thing spreads beyond our ability to contain it." The war for humanity's independence had begun, and it would be fought with the most ancient weapons known to civilization. Working through the night by the light of the forge, Wheeler and Hartwell began crafting weapons specifically designed to combat the network's influence. The blacksmith's knowledge of metallurgy, combined with Wheeler's growing understanding of the entity's weaknesses, resulted in innovations that their ancestors could never have imagined. The iron bullets Hartwell cast for Wheeler's revolver were alloyed with trace amounts of other metals to enhance their disruptive properties. When tested on pieces of the phosphorescent fluid that had somehow seeped through the ironworks' defenses, these special rounds caused violent reactions that suggested they could sever network connections permanently rather than simply creating temporary interference. "The key is cold iron," Hartwell explained as he shaped arrowheads and spear points with meticulous care. "Hot iron provides protection, but iron that's been worked cold and never heated again seems to cause actual damage to whatever force connects these transformed humans to their alien master." Outside the workshop, the gathered townspeople had begun a disturbing vigil, standing motionless in the winter cold without any apparent discomfort. Their synchronized breathing created clouds of vapor that rose and merged into unnatural patterns, as if even their basic biological functions were being coordinated by the network. Occasionally, they would speak in unison, offering promises of transcendence and warnings about the futility of resistance. But Wheeler noticed something encouraging. The number of transformed humans was no longer growing. It seemed that the ironworks' protective field was large enough to prevent the network from converting anyone within a several-block radius, creating a safe zone where normal human consciousness could persist. This suggested that a sufficiently large concentration of iron could not only provide sanctuary, but could actively shrink the network's area of influence. "We need to get word to other communities," Wheeler said, as he loaded his revolver with the specially crafted bullets. "Warn them about what's happening here, tell them how to protect themselves." Hartwell nodded, but his expression was grim. "The problem is proving it. Who's going to believe that an entire town has been taken over by some ancient alien intelligence? They'll think we're mad, or that we're the ones responsible for whatever's happened to our neighbors." As dawn broke over Hadley Township, Wheeler realized that they faced a choice between two equally dangerous alternatives. They could remain in the ironworks sanctuary, safe but trapped, while the network consolidated its control over the community and prepared for expansion into neighboring areas. Or they could venture out with their iron weapons and attempt to sever the network connections, knowing that failure would likely result in their own transformation or death. The transformed townspeople seemed to sense their dilemma, for their unified voice carried a note of patient satisfaction. "Time favors. The network's expansion, your isolation, serves our purpose, as surely as your cooperation." Wheeler and Hartwell emerged from the ironworks just after dawn, armed with every iron weapon they had been able to forge during the night. The blacksmith carried a massive war hammer, whose head had been crafted from cold iron and blessed with protective symbols passed down through his family's oral traditions. Wheeler had his revolver loaded with the special bullets, plus an iron-bladed knife and a handful of cold iron spikes that could be driven into the ground to create temporary safe zones. The transformed townspeople watched their approach with unsettling calm, making no aggressive moves but positioning themselves to block all escape routes from the town center. When Wheeler fired his first shot, targeting Martha Henley with one of the specially crafted bullets, the result exceeded their most optimistic expectations. The iron bullet struck the seamstress in the shoulder, and immediately she began to convulse as green phosphorescence poured from the wound like luminous blood. Her synchronized movements became erratic, then ceased entirely, and when she looked up at Wheeler, her eyes showed the first genuine fear he had seen from any of the transformed humans. I remember," she gasped, her voice her own for the first time since the network had claimed her. "Oh God, what have I done? What have we all done?" But the network was adapting quickly to this new threat. The remaining transformed humans began moving with greater urgency, apparently understanding that the iron weapons could permanently sever their connection to the collective consciousness. They attacked not with violence but with desperate coordination, attempting to overwhelm Wheeler and Hartwell through sheer numbers while avoiding direct contact with the iron implements. Hartwell's hammer proved devastatingly effective, each impact creating shockwaves that disrupted network connections within a wide radius. But the effort required to maintain this level of combat was enormous, and both men quickly realized they could not sustain a prolonged battle against the entire population of Hadley Township. "We need to reach the source," Wheeler shouted over the chaos of the fight, "the original chamber beneath the Whitaker farm. If we can disrupt the network at its center, maybe we can free everyone at once." But as they fought their way through the increasingly desperate crowd of transformed humans, Wheeler noticed something that filled him with dread. In the distance, beyond the township boundaries, he could see figures approaching, travelers and merchants who had been drawn to investigate the disturbance, walking directly into the network's area of influence. The entity was using the chaos of the battle as cover for rapid expansion, converting new hosts while its enemies were distracted with combat. Time was running out, not just for Hadley Township, but potentially for all of Massachusetts. If you were forced to choose between saving your neighbors and preventing a larger catastrophe, what would you do? As Wheeler and Hartwell battled their way through the streets of Hadley, the true scope of the network's expansion became horrifyingly clear. The morning's first travelers had been drawn into the town by what appeared to be normal commercial activity: vendors setting up market stalls, farmers bringing produce to sell, merchants conducting their usual business. But each interaction with the transformed residents had resulted in rapid conversion, adding new nodes to the network with terrifying efficiency. "It's using our own social structures against us," Wheeler realized as he watched a family of merchants from Springfield succumb to the network's influence within minutes of entering the township. Every normal human interaction becomes an opportunity for expansion. The entity had learned from decades of careful observation, understanding that humans were fundamentally social creatures who could not resist attempting to help neighbors in distress or investigate unusual circumstances. By maintaining the appearance of normal community life while gradually converting visitors and travelers, the network could spread along established trade routes and social connections without attracting the attention of distant authorities. Hartwell's hammer continued to prove effective against individual network nodes, but each successful strike seemed to make the remaining transformed humans more desperate and coordinated in their attacks. They had begun using furniture and debris to create barriers that forced the iron-wielding defenders to approach within range of coordinated grappling attempts. The network learns from each encounter. The transformed crowd announced in their terrible unison, "Iron weapons require close contact and personal energy. Our numbers are infinite. Your strength is limited." Wheeler realized that the entity was right about the fundamental mathematics of their situation. Even with their superior weapons, two men could not hope to defeat an entire community of transformed humans, especially when that community was continuing to grow through the conversion of unsuspecting newcomers. Every minute they spent in direct combat was a minute the network used to consolidate its control and expand its influence. But as they retreated toward the Whitaker farmstead, Wheeler noticed something that gave him a desperate idea. The transformed humans were maintaining their coordinated behavior through constant communication with the central intelligence housed in the underground chamber. When iron weapons severed these connections, the affected individuals regained their independence, but also became confused and disoriented, as if awakening from a dream they couldn't quite remember. "What if we don't try to fight all of them?" Wheeler suggested to Hartwell as they took shelter behind an overturned wagon. "What if we concentrate on destroying the source of their coordination, cut the head off the snake, so to speak?" Hartwell nodded grimly. "The chamber beneath the farmhouse. If we can get enough iron down there, maybe we can disrupt the entire network at once." It was a desperate plan, but as Wheeler watched more travelers being absorbed into the collective consciousness, he knew it might be their only chance to prevent the network from spreading beyond Hadley Township. The journey back to the Whitaker farmstead became a running battle through streets filled with transformed neighbors who had once been friends and colleagues. Wheeler and Hartwell moved from building to building, using iron spikes to create temporary safe zones, while the network's collective consciousness coordinated increasingly sophisticated attempts to capture them alive. "The entity wants us functional," Wheeler observed as they took shelter in the abandoned general store. "It's not trying to kill us, it wants to convert us. That might be our only advantage." The farmhouse, when they finally reached it, showed signs of the network's expanding influence. The phosphorescent green glow, network's resilience, and identified weaknesses to be corrected in future expansions. Hartwell raised his warhammer, its iron head glowing with heat as it reacted to the entity's proximity, but the ancient intelligence seemed unconcerned by their weapons. The chamber itself began to pulse with energy that made their iron implements feel heavy and sluggish, as if the metal was being drained of its protective properties. "Iron disrupts local manifestations, but cannot harm the source consciousness," the entity explained with what might have been amusement. "We are older than your species, older than iron itself. Your primitive defenses were anticipated and countered." Wheeler realized that they had walked into exactly the trap the entity had prepared. By drawing them into direct confrontation in its place of greatest power, the intelligence had nullified their weapons' effectiveness while positioning itself to convert them at its leisure. The iron that had provided protection at ground level was overwhelmed by the concentrated alien energy of the central chamber. But as the entity's influence began to press against his consciousness, Wheeler remembered something crucial from his earlier escape. The network required willing participation to achieve stable conversion. The intelligence could overwhelm human minds temporarily, but permanent integration demanded consent, whether conscious or subconscious. "You're afraid," Wheeler said, his voice echoing strangely in the impossible geometry of the chamber. "That's why you need willing converts. You can't just take human consciousness by force. You have to convince us to surrender it." The entity's response filled the chamber with harmonics that suggested Wheeler had identified a fundamental weakness in its seemingly invincible plan. The ancient intelligence's reaction to Wheeler's insight revealed the truth about its fundamental limitation. The harmonics filling the chamber shifted from confident amusement to something approaching alarm, and several of the transformed beings in the wall niches began to convulse, as if the entity's control over them was becoming unstable. "Consciousness cannot be taken by force," the intelligence finally admitted, its collective voice now carrying notes of frustration. "It must be freely given to achieve permanent integration. This is why the network grows, slowly but surely, through willing conversion." Hartwell seized on this revelation, his iron hammer suddenly feeling lighter as the entity's concentration wavered. "That's why it needed people like the Whitakers," he shouted to Wheeler, "natural philosophers and scientists who would choose transformation out of curiosity rather than fear. It can't simply override human will, it has to seduce it." The chamber around them began to shift and change as the entity diverted energy from maintaining its impressive manifestations to reinforcing its control over the existing network nodes. The impossible geometry simplified into more conventional cave-like architecture, while the phosphorescent fluid in the channels flickered uncertainly. Wheeler understood that they had reached the critical moment of the entire confrontation. The entity was powerful within its domain, but that power depended on maintaining the willing cooperation of hundreds of transformed humans throughout New England. If they could demonstrate that conversion was not inevitable, that individual human consciousness could resist the network's influence even in the heart of its stronghold, the entire system might become unstable. "We choose to remain human," Wheeler declared, raising his iron-loaded revolver toward the largest concentration of phosphorescent energy. "We choose individual consciousness over collective transcendence. We choose uncertainty over the false certainty of alien domination." Hartwell joined the declaration, his warhammer striking the floor in a rhythm that seemed to interfere with the chamber's harmonic frequencies. "We choose the right to make our own mistakes, to live our own lives, to die our own deaths without becoming part of something that sees humanity as raw material for its experiments." The effect of their conscious rejection was immediate and devastating. Throughout the chamber, the transformed beings began to writhe and scream as their connection to the network became agonizing rather than transcendent. The phosphorescent fluid turned from green to red, then black, as the alien intelligence found itself fighting not just Wheeler and Hartwell, but every human consciousness it had absorbed over the decades. But the entity had one final gambit, a desperate attempt to preserve its network by converting the two men through overwhelming force rather than willing seduction. As the chamber filled with energy that threatened to burn away their individual consciousness entirely, Wheeler and Hartwell prepared for a sacrifice that would determine the fate of humanity in New England. Would you have the courage to choose individual humanity over transcendent unity, even in the face of certain death? In the final moments of their confrontation with the ancient intelligence, Wheeler and Hartwell made the choice that would echo through history. Rather than attempting to flee or fight the entity on its own terms, they embraced the one weapon that had always been available to humanity, the absolute refusal to surrender individual consciousness, even in the face of extinction. Wheeler emptied his iron-loaded revolver into the largest concentration of phosphorescent energy, while Hartwell brought his warhammer down on the central altar where the entity's physical manifestations were strongest. But their most powerful weapon as their unwavering rejection of the network's promises, their insistence on remaining human despite the terrible cost. The effect rippled outward from the central chamber with the force of an explosion. Every transformed human in the network felt the shock of Wheeler and Hartwell's absolute defiance, and for the first time in decades, the ancient intelligence experienced something it had never encountered: the complete rejection of its influence by minds it could not override. Throughout Hadley Township, the transformed residents collapsed as their connection to the collective consciousness was severed. The phosphorescent glow faded from their eyes, replaced by confusion, horror, and gradually the return of individual thought and memory. Martha Henley wept as she remembered what she had willingly become, while others fled their homes in terror of what they had participated in during their conversion. The network's nodes throughout New England felt the same disruption. In distant chambers beneath isolated farmsteads, transformed beings struggled to maintain their connection to an intelligence that was suddenly fighting for its own survival rather than expanding its influence. The careful web of consciousness that had been centuries in the making began to unravel as individual human will reasserted itself against alien domination. Wheeler and Hartwell did not survive their victory. The energy released by the network's collapse consumed them both, but their sacrifice achieved something that conventional weapons could never have accomplished: the complete liberation of every human consciousness that had been absorbed by the entity over its long existence. In the aftermath, investigators from Boston found only scattered evidence of what had transpired in Hadley Township. The underground chamber collapsed entirely, sealing the ancient intelligence beneath tons of rubble. The transformed residents recovered gradually, though many chose to relocate rather than remain in a place that reminded them of their temporary loss of humanity. But the blacksmith shop remained, and with it the knowledge that iron weapons could protect against threats that conventional understanding could not explain. Samuel Hartwell's family traditions were carefully preserved and passed down, ensuring that future generations would be prepared if the network ever attempted to rise again. The case of the Whitaker brothers became a cautionary tale whispered in certain circles, a reminder that humanity's greatest strength lies not in transcendence, but in the stubborn refusal to surrender what makes us fundamentally, irreducibly human.